Thanks for tuning into the Sheet Metal Shaping Podcast, where we discuss the pursuit of sheet metal shaping education through traditional coach building techniques. My guest today on the show is Kyle Yocum of Yocum's Hotrods down in North Carolina. My man, thanks for being on the show.
Oh, thanks for having me, man. I really appreciate it.
I'm so fired up. You know, it's funny. When we're doing these episodes, sometimes I get people from like Australia, the UK, all these different time zones. It's nice to be doing one in the same time zone.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love it. And I'm a big fan of the Outer Banks too. Carolina's fantastic.
Yeah, we're not too far from there. Maybe an hour and a half. I don't make it to the beach very often. I'm more of a woods kind of guy.
Ah, very nice. Very nice. So kick it off. Tell the folks a little bit about yourself and about Yocum's.
I'm Kyle Yocum. I own Yocum Signature Hot Rods. We're in Sunbury, North Carolina. We specialize in obviously metal fabrication, metal shaping. We've got a body shop too, where we do body and paint, and that's pretty much what we do. We try and avoid as much of the mechanical stuff as possible. Stick to what we're good at.
That's cool. So for this episode, I want to talk to you about your Ferrari. You are hand sculpting a beautiful, beautiful Ferrari body. How did this come to be?
Well, it's kind of a long story. Well, I guess not so long. It started several years ago, though, where Mike and I, you mentioned Mike from Cornfield Customs, we've been doing sheet metal shaping classes together for years.
Mhm.
And we held one back at my old facility in Virginia, shoot, 6-7 years ago. And we had a student from Florida who came and was really interested in shaping some aluminum panels because his boss had a couple old Ferrari bucks that he wanted to turn into cars.
Wow.
And we did the class, and the kid did really well compared to a lot of guys with no experience. I was pretty impressed, but it was a little bit above the ability that he had at the time. And years down the road, his boss contacted me to actually build the car.
Wow. That's amazing. Like, just like, oh yeah, let's just whip up a Ferrari like tomorrow.
Well, yeah, it's like I said, the kid had great hands, and he
Mhm.
would have the ability to do it with some practice. But that
Yeah.
is a big project to jump into right
So
off the bat.
how did this boss acquire the boss of the person who was your student at the time? How did he acquire a series of bucks for these cars?
Well, I'm not exactly sure, to be honest. He's got a steel buck for, I think, a 250.
Mhm.
And this one, he did not have a buck for this one. He had a a book with some pictures and a 1/18th scale model, which is
Mm.
kind of what I got. And I'm not sure how he got the buck for the other one. If he had it made or if he purchased it from somebody else, I'm not sure. But I think that's as far as that project made it.
Gotcha. So you guys are doing the one, and is he still continuing on the other? Is that the idea, or you guys are just focusing on one right now?
We're just focusing on this one right now. Perhaps we'll get the other one in the future. I don't know.
Very cool.
A project like this is a big, long, expensive project. So by the end of it, you never know if that customer is going to want to do more or run screaming.
So yeah, that's right. Let's talk about the actual process itself. So, like, where do you start with something like this? How does this come to be?
So this is I would say it's not an exact replica. It's a representation of a
Yes.
65 275 GTB Competition Coupe.
Hmm.
Um, One pretty specifically that was down in Florida that had a lot of race history. That was the one that we were kind of modeling after. But the chassis is completely different. It's got a late model Ferrari drivetrain and suspension. And I believe the owner of the car actually built the chassis, shoot, 20 years ago.
Oh wow.
And has been through a couple other people that tried to build bodies for it and weren't quite able to come to the finish line.
Using the
So
same buck that you have, or different?
no, no. I'm not sure anybody started with an actual buck. When we got the car, it had kind of a tube structure that had been roughly assembled and welded to the chassis. That was We just cut it off. We just cut it off, put in the scrapyard. It wasn't quite, you know, it wasn't quite what it needed to be.
Yeah.
So we were able to find a 3D scan that I believe was actually designed for a video game. So it was pretty loose,
Oh no way.
pretty loose. But I
Yeah.
found a 3D scan and started with that. And we had that segmented and laser cut into 1/2 inch ply and just to fit the chassis that we have and the wheelbase and track width and all that is on this chassis, which is close to the original car, but not exact.
Mm-hmm.
We started from there and just kind of modified the buck to get the shapes closer to what they should have been, and went from there.
Nice, nice. So are you adapting the body to fit the chassis, or are you adapting the
Yes.
chassis to fit the body? Yeah.
Yes. Well, a little bit of both. A little bit of
Mm,
both, but mostly we're building the body to fit the chassis.
nice. I think I saw on your Instagram it was a 95, some kind of a 1995 Ferrari of some sort.
I believe so. Something like, and to be honest, I'm not 100% sure what it is.
Mm,
It's somewhere late 90s to early 2000s Ferrari V12.
nice.
Something
Nice.
fast.
Something fast. Hey, you know what? At least it's going to be somewhat original, or at least it'll be in the same vein. You know what I mean? It'll
Yeah.
be authentic Ferrari.
Yeah, I think at this point I'm kind of calling it a Ferrari resto mod,
Yeah. Yeah.
which is
That's
cool. Not too many of those out there.
It's so cool. And the fact that, like, I think some people get really buck nutty about things being 100% correct, which there's definitely a place for it. And I think there's also a place for the recreation stuff. You know what I mean?
Sure.
Like for somebody to afford an original 65 275 GTB, like there's very few people in the world that can do that, right?
Yeah, I think the car that we're modeling this one after, the guy just, or well, the guy that owned it passed away, and his family cleaned it up and sold it. And I want to say it was one of the highest priced cars ever sold. It was like north
Yeah.
of $100 million. So, and there's only one,
Yeah.
of that particular car.
Is that
So,
why this person wanted the 270? Because it was just like, there's only one, they can't have it. Therefore, let's go.
I think it was just a body style that he really liked, and it was one of those on his list of cars that he really wanted to have. And at that point, the guy that owned it was still alive, and I don't think it would have been available for sale even if he had the resources to purchase it. So,
Mm, yeah.
and when you buy something like that, that's not a car that you buy and put a lot of miles on. That's a
Yeah.
car that sits in a museum. So this one, granted, he's got a pile of money in it, of course,
Mhm.
but there's no intrinsic value to it outside of that. So hopefully he'll drive the heck out of this car. He's going to get a lot of looks and a lot of enjoyment out of it. Whereas something like that is, not that you can't drive it or shouldn't drive it, but most people probably wouldn't.
Yeah, it's like art at that point, right?
Right.
It's
Right.
art, rolling art.
hmm
So, okay, so now you got your buck built, you got it seated on the chassis. What comes next?
I started with the outside skins. There's a handful of ways to go about it, and I wouldn't say that my way is necessarily right or better than any other way, but where we started with this one was just outside skins, rough shape, some door skins and quarters, and kind of flowed from there to make sure that all the shapes were gonna flow together and all the light was gonna run through the car the way it was supposed to. And of course everything from that in to actually fit to the chassis and be functional.
Did you run tape along the buck just to eyeball it before
Yeah,
you
oh
started
yeah.
skinning? Yeah.
Tape, string, MIG wire, or TIG rod.
Yep.
Did all the things, and in areas will, if you need it, can kind of use some wireform methods to tighten up the edge of a panel or things like that. Not opposed to any particular method.
Yeah. However, get the job done, right?
hmm
Whatever you need. How
Absolutely.
close was the buck?
In some areas it was spot on, in others it was way off.
Yeah.
We he supplied us with a windshield, and I'm not sure how accurate these windshields are to the original car, but I can tell you to the buck it was a ways off.
Wow.
So we started with the windshield. I should back up. We started with the windshield. That was the first thing we fit to the buck. Because of course, in this case, when glass is available, you kind of have to build to the glass. So we fit the windshield to the buck, or fit the buck to the windshield, and went from there. Once we got everything to where it looked like it would play well and sweeps fit nicely, then we started shaping some sheet metal to it.
That's cool. It's amazing that you could even get a windshield that was even close, because I mean, I'm
Well,
sure these are hard to come by.
the 275 was, I believe, a production car, so they did build several 275s. The
Mm,
difference really comes in when you talk about the competition coupes. The
yep.
front end was a little bit different, and I think the louvers on the sides were a bit different. There were some differences, but the overall shape was basically a 275.
Very cool. I know another guy doing something similar in the Ferrari brand, but he had a set of headlight rings and a
hmm
windshield, and I think he had a set of reproduction wheels. and
There you
tire.
go.
But like,
Yep.
it's so funny to say, yeah, let's sculpt the car around the glass and 2 little pieces on the front end,
Yep.
and that's exactly
Absolutely.
that's the same thing as you're doing. It's amazing. So once you get the thing skinned, I mean, what type of material are we talking here? What are we using?
3003 aluminum,
Yep.
and I'm using 060, which
Mhm.
is of course considerably thicker than Ferrari would have used, but this is not going to be a race car.
Yeah.
060 is nice because it shapes really well, it holds its form nicely, and it's a little tougher. If somebody were to push the car from one side of the shop to the other, they're not going to leave handprints in it.
True, true. Wasn't it Smokey Yunick that did the acid dipping thing on his NASCAR? He dipped the
Possibly.
I from what I hear, maybe this is folklore, but he dipped the car in acid or some kind of an acid dip on the aluminum body or something like this, and it was basically like foil. It was so thin,
Jeez.
but it still met the form of the template to make it legal
We
or something.
we did a couple years ago. We did one of Carroll Shelby's King Cobras. It
Oh
was
wow.
CM363, which was a
Yeah.
heavily raced car, pretty well known car, and it was so thin that I could cut the panels apart with a pair of scissors.
Really?
I checked it in several areas because it was a race car, so it had been ground on and filed on and hammered all over the place. But I got measurements on that thing as thin as 20 thousandths.
No way.
It
Wow,
was ridiculous, and we
that's pop can
shaped.
material.
It was terrible, and we reshaped what we had to reshape out of 035 to get as
Mhm.
close as possible and still be able to weld it together. And
Yeah,
that
no
was
doubt.
that was tough.
Yeah. So let's talk about welding. Now that we're here, let's talk about welding this body together. So distortion, filler wire. Talk a little bit about that.
So, I over the years I've gone back and forth for a long time. I did the oxyacetylene welding with the flux,
Yep.
which worked well, but for me it was seemed slow and dirty. So I've switched over to a TIG process, and I'll use 1100 fill rod, just 1/16, nothing super special,
Hmm.
and I've had really great results with that. I'm not no worries about welds cracking. I'll generally weld the top side and fuse the bottom,
Hmm.
if I have access, and then I can planish it and file it and do whatever I need to do, and I don't have any problems with welds cracking or anything like that.
Yeah. Do you weld the front side and the back, or can you get away with one?
You can get away with one if you get good penetration, but I do like to come back on the backside and just fusion weld the backside.
Hmm.
And it seems more than anything, it seems to even out that weld on the backside of the panel, makes planishing it just a little faster, a little smoother.
Yeah, that's a good point. Do you prefer like when you're welding these panels? Do you prefer to clamp it up? Do you prefer to weld it on the buck? Do it on the bench? What's the best way for something like this?
All depends on the panel, how big it
Mm,
is, how tight the form is. If I've got panels that fit together really, really nicely, which yeah, I'd love to say every single panel I ever make fits together perfect, but in the real world, that's sometimes a couple clamps are needed.
yeah.
Sometimes you don't need to. Sometimes you can tack one end and just manipulate it with your hands and tack through the panel and weld from one end to the other.
Hmm.
If it's a big panel and I need the buck to hold it in place, then I'll tack it together on the buck. I don't usually like to weld solid on the buck, just because you end up with contamination from the wood burning on the backside and things like that. I don't have access to both sides of the panel, so I'll tack it together, remove it from the buck, and weld it on the bench or on a stand.
Yeah.
But everyone, there's no rock solid rule on how it has to be done. Not for me,
Yeah.
anyways.
It's kind of interesting because everybody does have their own way to do it. And I mean, like you say, some people might say, "Oh yeah, that's all we do is weld on the buck, keeps it straight." Like, okay. And
Sure,
some people say, "Hey,
sure.
let's take it off, put it on the bench because I can get back access." Okay. Like you're right.
Well,
There's no rules.
and you're gonna get some level of distortion from the weld, no matter how you weld it.
Hmm.
So it's gonna have to be planished. It's gonna have to be hammer worked. So the amount of distortion that I see from it hanging on the buck versus being on the bench is the same. Yeah, I don't see a difference one way or the other.
Hmm.
And like I said, I've done it both ways. I do it both ways. If I have a panel that I'm concerned it's going to put too much stress where the weld is, if I've got a really long section on either side of the weld and it's going to try and droop while I'm welding it, then yeah, sure, leave it on the buck. That way it doesn't, you don't lose form in that area. But otherwise, it doesn't seem to cause any problem.
And do you have a preference in terms of wood versus a wire form?
I prefer wood. I prefer wood. And I'll build them. I'm doing a motorcycle project right now that I can't talk too much about yet, but the buck for it, it's not replicating anything. It's come from a designer, so we've got some free play there, and I'll build the buck just a touch fat, like a maybe a Sharpie line, and then I
Mhm.
can actually sand the buck almost like you'd block the side of a car and get all the stations to really jive together nicely. Whereas with the wire
Oh,
form,
yeah.
that's a little bit tougher. You've got to bend it.
Mhm.
Not that it can't be done. Um, but I grew up a carpenter's son, so I'm pretty comfortable with wood.
That's right. I guess it is nice to be able to say, okay, take that 3D scan, send it to the laser, or not laser, but like water jet cutter or the router, however you do it. And like in a day, you've
Hmm.
got all these slices that you can assemble versus having to hand assemble a wire form, right?
Yep, right, right.
Mm.
And I've done them. A lot of them I do, with corrugated cardboard and a jigsaw.
Ah.
I'll make the stations out of cardboard to get the shape close, and then trace that onto a piece of 1/2 inch ply, cut it out with a jigsaw.
Mhm.
It's not the fastest process, but it works well for one-off things.
Would you do that for a full car?
Oh man, I'd rather not. I think if it came to a full car, if I had access to a car that I could, take measurements and profiles off of, I would just have it 3D scanned.
Mm, that's a good point.
That technology is available nowadays, and it's relatively inexpensive and so much faster.
What does it cost to 3D scan a car? I've never been exposed to that.
I haven't had one done yet.
Mhm.
Like I said, I've been able to just find 3D scans that were already done, and that's
Mhm.
very inexpensive. I mean, we're talking a couple $100.
Yeah.
But even if it cost 5 grand to have a car scanned, by the time you laid it out every 6 inches and took a profile every six
Mhm.
inches, the amount of time that you would have in it, and cutting all those stations out by hand, man, it would be well worth the 5 grand to have it
No,
done.
no doubt, and the time too.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh my gosh. So if you had to ballpark it, if you had to build that car you have now, the 275 in a wire form, how long do you
Hmm.
think it would take you to do just the form, assuming you had quality photos that you could scale and so on?
Uh, I've never done a full car that way,
Hmm.
so I couldn't really answer you honestly. I'm sure it would take me a week, a couple weeks, but that's a guess from no experience. I've
Yeah.
done real small wire forms like a motorcycle tank
Yeah.
or something like that, and I've done wire forms on custom projects where I'm kind of connecting two areas together,
Mhm.
and I'll use a thicker TIG rod, and I can manipulate that around and tack the pieces together. But as
Right.
far as a full car goes, I've never done one.
Interesting. Interesting. Yeah, this is super cool, man. I mean, just the fact that you even had the opportunity to do something like this for such an iconic brand and such an iconic vehicle is spectacular.
Oh, absolutely. It's been a blast too.
No
Very
doubt.
challenging in some areas, but been a blast.
So before we move on and talk about the rest of the build, let the folks know like where are you at in this process so far?
We are almost done.
Oh, nice.
Actually hoping that the car is going to leave by the end of October. So the body is shaped. 99% of the structure is done. The only seams that I have left to weld on the body are actually at the top of the windshield posts, and those are the last two seams that, until they're welded, I can still remove the skin from the structure. So
Nice.
that'll be kind of the last thing that happens. I've still got the dash to build. We're gonna do a small roll bar in it and a handful of things like that. But we are real close to the end of this one.
What do you think some of the tougher parts of that car were?
Um, the hardest things are the functional things. Making hinges that work properly and latches work
Mm,
properly and windows
mhm.
go up and down, vent windows that function. All the things that we kind of take for granted every time we get in and out of a car. When we're building a car from scratch, a lot of that stuff's not necessarily available. So
Mhm.
from simple things like finding door latches that fit and function to making a door handle that will connect to that and work every time you want to get in and out of the car, and windows that roll up and down when the interior door panel is a different angle than the window and you've got limited space, things like that.
Yeah.
That's more challenging than actually shaping the sheet metal in a lot of ways, because there's
Because you're,
less
yeah,
fudge room.
you're engineering as you go in a sense.
Kinda, kinda, and like a lot of us in this industry, I'm just a knuckle dragging caveman. I swing a club, literally swing a club for a living. So I'm certainly no engineer.
Make window, go up, go.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. If it doesn't work,
Yeah.
swing the hammer a little harder.
That's right. That's right. In terms of like, I think as you mentioned, like door jambs and latches and stuff, this is some of the most unappreciated work too, because
Absolutely.
you see the fenders, you see the roof skin, you see all these beautiful pieces, the highlight lines that run down the side, this beautiful Coke bottle shape. Nobody thinks like, wow, nice door latch. Like no,
Right, right.
nobody says that.
Yeah. Wow, it's really cool that those windows go up and down.
It's like an expectation.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it truly is. And when you build a car like this, you can have it, just like you said, a beautiful car that aesthetically, from a an artistic standpoint, is absolutely beautiful. I won't say perfect, because none of mine
Mhm.
are, and I bet most of the other ones are not either. But if the first time or the 100th time that client goes to get in that car, the door latch doesn't function properly, or they go to roll down the window and the window doesn't move the way it's supposed to,
Mhm.
nothing else matters. No
That's
matter
right.
how beautiful that car is, no matter how hard you've worked on it, if it doesn't function properly, nothing else matters.
Yeah.
So it's
Do you go
underappreciated, but it's certainly important.
It's true. Do you go through a period with the client of like setting expectation and saying, okay, this is a hand built car. These are some of the things that could go wrong, or how does that look?
Oh yeah, I mean, we discuss it through the process, and we try and make sure that they're well covered and we're well covered. As when the car leaves the shop, it's not like we close the door on it and forget about it.
Hmm.
We try and make sure they understand that we've done as much of a shakedown as we can. I've opened and closed these doors 10,000 times, and I've rolled this window up and down 10,000 times, and have gotten it to where it functions really well. That doesn't mean that on that 1100th time it's not going to fail,
Yeah.
but we've done everything we can to ensure that hopefully it will not. And if it does, you call us and we take care of it, and it
Yeah.
is what it is.
Yeah. You've got a summer student there just sitting there working the door latch all day,
Right.
all
Right.
night. Like,
Well,
this is your
I,
job. Go.
yeah. Yeah. I kind of do it when I'm working on something like that. Almost every time I walk past the car, I'll
Yep.
open and close the door.
It's like turning opposite of acetylene tanks. Grab
Yep.
the valve every time you walk by.
Yep.
Just make sure.
Exactly. Exactly.
That's funny. In terms of shaping a car that's got a full roof with functional side glass versus one that doesn't, spider or convertible, how much work is different between
Oh,
the
a
two body
ton.
styles?
A ton. A ton. There's a lot that goes on from the top of that windshield back to the bottom of the back glass. And of course,
Mhm.
like you said, you've got the top of your doors. In this case, um, the window guides, the window channels are brass, made them out of brass, and they've
Wow.
got vent windows in them. So you've got windows that go up and down, and vent windows that function. And there's quite a bit there. Plus the structure that goes into the roof skin itself, which is probably the simplest part. Making sure that your window channels are shaped well and are going to support a piece of glass. Yeah, there's a lot there.
Yeah. Why brass for the window channels?
It's easy to form. It's nice and stiff, but it doesn't bend easily.
Hmm.
So it's got some weight to it, but it's not terribly heavy. It's easy to work with.
Mhm. Mhm. Do you have to machine it down, like put a channel down the middle, or can you buy it pre-roll formed?
So in this case, I was able to buy a U channel and just machine the edges down. It was a little
Nice.
bit tall, so I could
Yeah.
machine it down. I think I took about an eighth of an inch off of it, and then I can bend it, heat it and bend it to the shape I needed it to be, and weld it where I need it welded. It
Mhm.
worked out really well.
I've heard it takes chrome well. Is that true?
Say that again. Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Are you typically chroming stuff like part components like this, or would this be a painted part?
This will be a chromed part. We won't be having to deal with any of that stuff. We're going to send this one back to the customer as a bare metal car. So
Oh,
he's
no
going
way.
to deal with all his own body and paint, all his own chrome.
Mhm.
It's kind of the ideal project. We get to
Yeah,
deal with
really.
the fun stuff, but none of the headaches.
Ever done a polished body?
I have not on a car.
Yeah.
I've done some polished motorcycle parts, and I've polished some car parts, but I have not had to do an entirely polished body yet.
Man, I would only imagine The extra work involved in a polished versus a body filled body, even if it's
Yeah.
a 16th of an inch of filler,
Yep.
like, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
that'd just be
Absolutely.
exponential.
Absolutely. And we try and metal finish them pretty close, but there's a huge difference between pretty close and perfect.
Yeah. Yeah. Any preference in terms of metal finishing? Do you prefer using power tools, hand tools? What's the best?
A combination of, but I find myself that last little bit, I've got a favorite slapper and a
Mm,
set of dollies that tend to be my go-to. All airplanish up to a certain point, but I've found that I can get that last little bit faster and better without really changing the shape of a panel
yep.
by hand. And
Gotcha.
I've been doing it that way since forever.
Yeah. And how close, in your opinion, based on your experience and what you've been working on for this car and in the past, like
Mhm.
how close is close enough relative to the end result desired?
Well, there's no such thing as close enough.
Hmm.
I'll never be entirely happy with one, of course. But generally, once I get to a certain point where it feels good when I run my hand across the panel, and anybody who's in this business is going to know, you know where that feel is.
Hmm.
That I'll block the panel at that point, usually with 320 on a long block, and that'll show you that is the first time you do it, that's a disheartening process because it
You're like,
goes from
oh man.
feeling and looking really,
Yeah.
really good to then
Yeah.
all of your imperfections are highlighted.
Hmm.
And I'll block it and I'll run through and knock up highs and knock down highs and knock up lows and run through that way with a block until I feel that it's as good as I can reasonably get it.
Hmm.
And of course, it depends on the project. Some projects require more time and the budget allows it, and some projects, you know, I don't want to say good enough is good enough, but
Yeah.
you
Got to
have to
keep
let the
moving.
client kind of dictate where you
Hmm.
stop.
For sure. For something like a Ferrari, I mean, would this be as close as you can get it? Is the goal, or is this
This was
something
pretty
else?
darn close.
Yeah.
Yeah, this was pretty darn close.
Nice. When you're working to the buck, I mean, how close would be considered correct for this car when you're working to something where you're saying, "Hey, I want it to fit this shape." How close is close?
Um, in this case, I ended up making some changes from the buck to accommodate, like I said, the wheelbase and
Hmm.
make sure that everything flowed together well. The buck was lacking in a couple areas. It was a little bit almost thin in the hips. The top of
Yep.
the quarters were a little bit flatter than I wanted them to be. So I deviated from the buck just a little bit, and it comes to a point where you start out by the buck telling you where you're wrong,
Hmm.
and it'll come to a point where your sheet metal is telling the buck where it's wrong.
Wow.
And the better your
Smart.
buck is, obviously, the more you're going to listen to the buck, and it depends on what you started with. If we
True.
if we had the ability to go to the original car and scan it, then I would have a lot more faith in the buck that we were working with. But since we bought a buck off the internet that who knows what they scanned. They may have scanned a 1/18th model to
Sure.
make this buck. And of
Mhm.
course, when you scale something down like that, you have some discrepancies there. If you try and scale a 1/18th model in every aspect, it'll look like a cartoon.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, so I deviated where I had to, where I felt like I had to get the shapes to flow together nicely.
Yep. Yeah. What about some of the inner work? So, I mean, again, this is probably another underappreciated area of shaping and of building cars. Is like nobody says, "Hey, nice floor pans" or "nice firewall." They say,
Right.
"Beautiful fender," right?
Yep.
Like,
Right.
yeah. What does the inside look like?
It's still slick looking. It's not, there's not a whole lot of shape on the inside. Lots of flat fabrication work on the inside of the car, on the underside of the car.
Mhm.
But of course, again, it's all pretty critical because that's what the pretty stuff hangs on,
Yeah.
and it's not tightly based off of anything. We kind of had to shape the body and make it fit to the chassis.
Mhm.
So in some areas, we tried to make it similar to what the original car would have been. The firewall has footwells cut into it, kind of like the original cars did. Some other areas that we stole some ideas from, but for the most part, it's from somewhere deep in the back of my head.
You're like, "Oh, this feels right. Let's go with that."
Kind of
Yeah.
experience from working on other cars and how they were built and
Mhm.
what will work and what I feel like won't work. Try and build it strong and safe.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, this is going on the road.
Yep.
This is a real deal, right?
Yep.
Would it be titled as the Ferrari that is the chassis? Like, would this be the chassis number title?
Yes. Yes.
And what does a doorpost look like, for example? Like, explain. You said flat work, so explain for the
Mhm.
listeners what an inner, like, what do the inner guts look like for somebody who wouldn't know?
Like an A pillar on this one is
Yeah.
essentially a piece of tube vertically, built out of sheet metal, built out of all 080 aluminum. A lot of the 080 is like 5052, just a
Mhm.
structural aluminum. Uh, Different gussets and multiple layers. Kind of difficult to describe without a photograph.
Yeah.
But thinking if you were to build a structure where your weak points will be and gusseting those properly and making sure that where stress is going to be is supported well. In an A pillar, you've got where your door hinges go,
Mhm.
which of course carry a certain amount of vertical load when the door is shut, but really when the door is open, they carry a lot more load in a different
Yeah.
direction.
Yeah.
And it's a structural point where the firewall meets, and God forbid you were to get hit from the side, that's what's protecting your legs and keeping the door from crushing you. So there's a lot there that has to be pretty stout.
How much tube work would be inside of a body like this? Are we talking full roll cage off-road buggy type, or are we talking something different?
No, this one's going to have just a simple roll bar
Mhm.
at his request. I mean, I think a cage would be great, but again, it's not going to be a race car, and he doesn't want to have to climb around a cage.
Yeah.
That would take a lot away from the aesthetics of the inside of the car.
Mhm.
So we're going to build a simple roll bar that will go, basically above and behind your head and back down to where the rear suspension is. That'll give some side impact protection, some rollover protection, but there's of course, a small amount of risk that anybody takes when they get in an old car of any kind. They're
Mhm.
not exactly as safe as our 2023 models tend to be.
It does certainly make you appreciate a modern vehicle and all of the modern conveniences that come along with that, safety
Yes.
included.
Yep. Of course.
Yeah. Yeah. Floor pans. If you're doing a floor pan for something like this, do you start flat? Do you start with a shape in mind? How does that
Yep.
go?
These ones are pretty much flat. These are about as simple of a floor pan as you get. We've got one joggle that kind of runs from front to back, and a flange on one side and the other, and that's pretty much it. There's not a whole lot to these at all. It's a big
Wow.
tunnel in the center,
Mhm.
because it's got a transaxle, so it's got a tunnel that the torque tube runs through. But other than that, there's not a whole lot of shape to them. Braces that are going to be on the underside that
Mhm.
actually connect it to the chassis, but
And then
top of the floor is flat.
a lot of like spot welding type of work or rivets.
There will be some rivets, some spot welds, and a lot of kind of edge welds.
Nice. Okay, so let's talk timelines. How
Sure.
long have you been working on this thus far? I don't know if you mentioned it or not. I forget.
I've been on this car just under 2 years, I think,
Mhm. Mhm.
and of course working on other projects as well. So I think I'll have, probably in the neighborhood of 2,500 hours in this
Yep.
one,
By the time it rolls out the door.
something like that. Yep.
That's pretty cool. From what I understand, that seems to be about right for a car of this nature.
hmm
2,000, 3,000, 2,500, somewhere in there. Is that the flavor you get from the industry as well?
Yeah, I agree. And I have not done many, many, many full bodies,
Mhm.
so I don't have a long list to give you an average from. But from the way that this one went together, there was not a lot of, oh shoot, go back and redo it. It went together pretty smoothly.
Mm,
Um, and I'd like to think I'm relatively efficient when it comes to the shaping process.
yeah.
So I'd say that's probably a pretty solid average between 2 and 5,000 hours, depending on the car, and they could be way more or way less depending on how complicated. Like we discussed earlier, is it a roadster or is it a coupe? Is
Yeah.
it Does it have a trunk that opens and closes? And and
Yeah, for sure. You figure you'd save what, like 20, 30% if there's no top to it?
probably 20%,
Yeah.
something like that. I mean,
That's
there's
substantial.
so much time in windows and doors, and not so much the roof itself. That's a pretty darn simple panel,
Mhm.
but you've got more more door gap to deal with because you're dealing with the gap from the window channel to the roof, and yeah, there's definitely quite a bit there. Maybe 20% is a little heavy, but it would definitely be substantial.
And are you doing this all yourself, or do you have help in the shop? You got guys?
I do have guys. This project is one that I'm doing pretty much myself. I'm the only one in the fab shop. I've got three guys, or well, I should say two guys and a gal that work
Mhm.
in the body shop side.
Nice.
Um, that are phenomenal. That's not
Yeah.
not my area of expertise by any means. So I've got a pretty cool crew over there.
It's good to have a
Yeah,
good team, right?
indeed,
Yeah,
indeed.
for sure. How much do you rely on those folks? I mean, I'm sure they're an integral part of the operation.
Oh, a ton. Moose, my body shop manager he's incredible. I don't know what I'd do without him. That's a Like I said, I did grow up kind of in the auto body world. I painted for a real short time in the aircraft industry, and I went to all the auto body tech schools, trade schools, but that's a world that I've been out of for so long that I rely on them for all the body and paint side. I know when it looks right. I know when it's right and I know when it's not right, but how to
Yeah.
bridge the gap between the two is what I rely on them for.
Let's talk tools. So, what are some of your favorite tools in the shop that you're using to build this body?
I mean, I'm a power hammer guy. I've got an old LK90 Yoder
Mhm.
that I've done, all of the heavy shaping on. I've got one of Chris Rush's, Bailey's big yellow English wheels,
Mhm.
handful of air planishers, and my hand tools.
Yeah. Do you prefer the wheel or the hammer overall, or are you good with both?
I enjoy both. I am most definitely a power hammer guy.
Yeah.
Yeah, as you know, you're either a hammer guy or a wheel guy in
It's
most
so
cases.
it's so funny. Every episode I talk about this. Like, are you a hammer guy? Are you a wheel guy?
Yep,
And
you're a
where's
hammer
the
guy
great
or wheel
divide?
guy.
Yeah.
And I guess it kind of started the way I started this stuff was by hand, 100% by hand. I didn't have a wheel.
Yeah.
I had nothing, so it was more or less a rock and a chisel. And
Caveman, right?
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I went from that to a real low dollar English wheel, like so many of us did.
Mhm.
And I shaped a lot of panels that way that I probably wouldn't even accept as my own today. Um, and when I found the power hammer, I just realized that I was able to repeat shapes effectively and efficiently, or more effectively and more efficiently than I personally could with a wheel. So if I
Mm,
had to build the same panel several times, I could almost map out, in a notebook, the way I shaped that panel and repeat it, shoot, almost exactly. I
like
can
where to
build.
put the blows and where to put the bends and
Right,
so forth. Yeah.
right. Where to put the shrink, how deep to shrink, how many passes to run, what radius dies I started with to planish it. And, I kind of fell in love with how fast and how efficient it was, how
Mhm.
quickly you could put shape in a panel. Not that you can't quickly put shape in a panel with a stump and a mallet and a wheel. I just found that I was more accurate with the power hammer.
Interesting. Interesting. In terms of cost, I mean, a power hammer is significantly more dollars for somebody starting out, for
Certainly,
example, than,
certainly. Yep, and I started with and I guess I should add into that when my first power hammer was one of Bailey's power hammers. Oh, I'm having a bit of a brain fart, but the MH19, their
Ah,
MH19, a multi hammer,
yep.
which acts kind of as a pullmax too.
Mhm.
So it
You can lock the column, right?
yep, it served multiple functions, and at that point when I bought it, I knew so little about power hammers that it looked like an incredible machine to me through pictures on the internet. Take
Mhm.
that for what it's worth.
Mhm.
And I bought the machine mostly because I could finance it. I
Really?
was early in business and we were eating a lot of ramen noodles and hot dogs at that point. And I could finance it. I had some projects in the shop that I thought I really needed it for, which I did.
Yep.
Um, and I learned how to use a power hammer with that machine. And I came to know Chris, who's actually the designer of that machine, Chris Rush,
Yep.
who's a absolutely brilliant engineer, probably one of the smartest guys I've ever met.
Hmm.
And became friends with him, became friends with Mike, and really learned how to use that machine, how to break it many times. And I
Hey, That's how you learn,
graduated
right?
to
Yeah.
the graduated to the Yoder about 5 years ago, and just still stand by that. For me, it's
Hmm.
faster, it's more efficient. I really know the direction I'm going. As soon as I put the dies in the hammer, I know what I can do with it, where I can put the shape, and how I can take that shape back out if I have to. And
Yeah.
I just don't have that level of efficiency with the wheel.
Do you find that historic tools are more, we'll say, sought after or of better quality than something modern constructed?
Um, well, the older tools, like the Yoder, are sought after. For one, yeah, because they're cool. I mean, we like old tools. Very simple, very effective, very hard to break, and very easy to fix.
Mm.
Now, like I don't have my Baileigh hammer anymore. It's with a friend of mine down in Texas now. But I had 5 years with it, and I've had 5 years with this one, and I can, honestly say that they both have their advantages. I
Yep.
really I thought when I got the Yoder, that I would never miss my other hammer, but there are certainly aspects of it that I do.
Hmm.
You know,
Like,
it dials down. You've got digital control on it, which is kind of a bit of a lazy man function because you can do the
mhm.
same thing with the Yoder.
Sure.
Um, but I've found that for real fast, real simple jobs, the smaller hammer, the lighter hammer has some benefits.
Hmm.
It could almost act like a planishing hammer,
Yep.
having the
Just
ability to
because you can
toss.
feather it.
Yeah, you can, in which you can feather this Yoder too.
Mhm.
But it is a different feel, and I don't know a better way to describe it than that. And it's a different feel. And
Yeah.
I've got a lot of hours on both machines. I love both machines. Um, but yeah, I would not say, if you had all the money in the world and you said which one should I buy, I'm not sure I could tell you 100% one or the other. Or that you would benefit more from one than the other.
Sure.
There are lots of guys out there that will tell you, oh, the legacy machines are better, and that's what you need to get if you're a real true professional in this industry. And there are other guys out there that have, maybe more money than experience, and kind of, not that I had more money than experience, but no money and no experience, and I saw the new machine and thought, oh man, shiny new machine's got all the bells and whistles. Um, but they both serve the same function at the end of
Hmm.
the day.
Yeah, for sure.
Some guys will
So,
disagree with me on that, but that's okay.
hey, you know what? That's how people learn, though. It's how they grow. It's like, oh, I know, let's try a little bit of column A. We'll try a little bit of column B, and all of a
Hmm.
sudden, column C emerges, and you're like, this is better than the first two,
Yeah.
or vice versa. You're like, no, the tried and true is the way to go.
Well, and they're
That's
they're they're both good, and they're all good, because a lot of those new machines nowadays, they're built on top of the experience that the old machines gave.
true.
So unless it's something low dollar that the engineering really was not put into, a lot of the new machines still serve the same function as the old machine, because that's what they're trying to, you know, boot out of the way.
Yeah,
They're
yeah,
trying to sell you the new machine for one, so you don't have to hunt down an old machine,
true.
but you know,
Track it
also,
across the country and get it to your location, right?
right, right. I drove to Colorado from North Carolina to get my Yoder.
Nice, nice. They're so few and far between, right? They pop up, but not often.
Hmm. Well, and the guys down at that are building the Pettingills now,
Yep,
they have
in
really,
Michigan.
yeah, they've given us a whole new option, because now you can have a legacy machine that is
Brand
a
new.
brand new machine. And
Yeah.
I haven't had the opportunity to run one yet, but from what I understand, they're phenomenal.
For sure. Would getting some of those guys on the show, like tool guys, would that? Do you think that would be a good episode?
Oh
Chris
yeah,
Rush or
absolutely.
I think it's Hans and Pettingill.
Yeah, absolutely. I think both of them would be amazing. Chris,
Nice.
I've gotten to know Chris pretty well over the years, and he's one of the most amazing people I've ever met. I don't even think he went to college for engineering. He just got a job as a tooling engineer and went from there.
Just
And
had an eye for it.
he's amazing. He's an incredible guy. Great human too. Just an all around good dude.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, man, this has been so much fun. I could say the same about you, from this side of the mic, you're very humble guy, obviously very experienced and very good at your craft. And the fact that you came on today, shared a bit about the Ferrari, shared a bit about tools, what are you working on in the shop and this kind of thing. It's very cool to see that there's people like yourself out there who are willing to give back to the shaping community.
I appreciate that.
For me to you, I appreciate you being here. So where can people find out more about you?
Our Instagram is not super active, but on occasion I'll post stuff up there. It's just at Yocum's Rod Shop. We've got a website, yocumsrodshop.com. Those are the places where you can kind of follow me the easiest. I'm not real great about posting things on online, as many of us are so busy it's hard to find time to do it. But that's where you can find me or reach out to me if you needed anything. But that's pretty much it, man. Swinging my hammer, trying to keep building things.
Amazing. Well, thanks for tuning into the Sheet Metal Shaping Podcast. Don't forget to like, share, follow, subscribe, and for goodness sakes, tell a friend if you had enjoyment or fun listening to this episode. And until next episode, we will catch you on the next episode. Thanks so much.
Thanks a bunch, man.